Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we all meet on today. I'm on the lands of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay respects to elders past and present and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. Cultural approaches to caring for country have existed for millennia, and at the Net Zero Commission, we seek to listen, learn, and build strong partnerships with First Nations peoples across New South Wales. Welcome to the Net Zero Commission's Call for Evidence webinar on the Pathways project. I am Will Raywood-Smith, the Executive Director of the Net Zero Commission. The Pathways project will show how sectors across the economy can work together to achieve New South Wales's legislated emissions reduction targets. And your input will help ensure that the pathways are built properly and that they are grounded in real-world, up-to-date data and practical experience. So thank you very much for your participation in this call for evidence. So I'll briefly introduce the Net Zero Commission, and then I'll pass to my colleague Ruby Khan, Principal Advisor at the Commission, who will provide an overview of the Pathways project and our call for evidence. So please use the Q&A function to ask questions at any time, and they will be answered at the end. And for the Q&A, we'll be joined by Manuel Wyrick from our missions team and our project partners, Stuart Witten from CSIRO and Tim Graham from ClimateWorks Centre. So quick introduction to the Net Zero Commission. So the New South Wales Climate Change Act passed in 2023, and the Act established guiding principles for action to address climate change here in New South Wales. The Act put in place our New South Wales legislated emissions reduction targets and adaptation objective to be more resilient to a changing climate. It also established the Net Zero Commission as an independent agency to track progress and provide recommendations. So many jurisdictions globally have similar agencies, with the UK establishing its Independent Climate Change Committee in 2008. So I suppose, what does the Net Zero Commission look like? Well, the Net Zero Commission comprises 8 commissioners on a 5-year term and 25 ongoing staff. So our commissioners and staff have expertise in key areas of climate change. Professor Frank Yotso is the lead commissioner for the Pathways project. The Commission operates independently, but is accountable to New South Wales Parliament, and we report to the Joint Standing Committee on Net Zero Future, who monitor and review the Commission's functions under the Act. So I suppose, what are those functions? We'll have a look at those now. So we assess progress towards the legislated emissions reduction targets and the adaptation objective, including reviewing current action. And we recommend action that should be taken by the New South Wales Government. And the New South Wales Government must then respond to any recommendations from the Commission. Finally, we communicate our work to help promote action to address climate change. So all of our recent publications are available on our website, such as our recent brief on the economic impact of climate change to New South Wales, our spotlight report on heat stress, our submission on data centres as examples. So the Pathways project that we're talking about today is really strongly aligned to our legislated functions, providing an evidence base that we can assess emissions progress against, showing areas that require additional action on emissions reduction, and also being a resource that many stakeholders have helped shape and can utilise. So I'm now going to pass to my colleague Ruby, who will take us through the project and the call for evidence. Thank you.
Thanks, Will. Hi, everyone. I'm Ruby Khan, as Will said, one of the principal advisors at the Commission. And today I'll be giving an overview of our Decarbonisation Pathways project. Pathways are used around the world by similar legislated independent bodies like ourselves. And what they do is they build clarity and confidence on how we actually track on the path to net zero. For us in New South Wales, the pathways will be a useful and robust evidence base for everyone to understand how, as a state, can we go about to achieve our legislated targets. This is our first set of New South Wales specific pathways, looking at how different sectors can decarbonise together. And as Will was mentioning, we have functions under the Act, and as part of our independent role, we want to ensure that we're providing practical, clear evidence-based advice to government on how the progress to the targets can be improved. And the pathways will give us a means for that, including how to monitor progress and how to inform decision making around the state. So this slide goes into a few of the areas that the pathways will be able to help with. And I guess the main points I want to point out is that they will improve the certainty and offer a long-term evidence-based approach to how we achieve net zero. It also gives a roadmap to decision-making and investment to support an orderly and just transition. But before I go into the pathways, I just want to kind of show what the government's already doing. Some of the people on this call might already be familiar with the New South Wales government's projections, which are published annually. The projections provide insight into the emission trends and progress being made. It's the government's view of how the state is tracking with emissions. It doesn't necessarily mean meeting the targets, as we saw from last year's projections. There is a gap. And if we look at, there's also the greenhouse gas inventory, which is compiled by the Commonwealth Government. It provides insight into the past emissions. So what we're doing in this project, distinct from the projections of the forward-looking estimates of only the current and anticipated action in New South Wales, pathways will actually highlight actions beyond current commitment and identify what is needed to reach our targets. Before I kind of go into the details of that, I just want to, for those who might not be familiar, the Commission looks into 8 sectors, or we break up our sources of emissions into 8 sectors and subsectors. And what you can see on the screen are the 8 sectors. Not on this slide is carbon management, and that includes things like carbon removals in land and aquatic systems, direct air capture, carbon capture and storage or use, and that will be also considered for the Pathways Code project because it's an important part of how we're actually reaching net zero. And to do this work, we're working with CSIRO and Climateworks Centre to model 3 different pathway scenarios. So we want to model multiple pathways to look at different choices and sequencing of actions to reach the state's targets. To develop the 3 pathways, we need to determine inputs and assumptions for each scenario based on technology, costs, behavioural factors and constraints. And you can see we've given an illustrative pathway on the right there. What it shows, the output will show is that what each sector actually needs to do to help contribute to New South Wales meeting the targets. And it provides an insight into the interactions and interdependencies across the different sectors to help support policy, infrastructure and investment decisions. So what are the 3 scenarios that we're looking to develop? I'll start from the left with the delayed pathway scenario. What that essentially will mean is the higher barriers to uptake of technology and behaviour change across all sectors. And this may look like a conservative improvement to technology and behaviour change among people and businesses. So things moving quite slowly. On the other end of that scale is the fast-tracked pathway, where it's an optimistic scenario where there's not many barriers to adopting new technology and people and businesses are choosing low emissions options due to better opportunities. So things will move faster and it'll be easier than potentially we anticipate. And then in the middle is our middle of the road, more balanced scenario where it'll be what we will probably view as the most achievable yet ambitious pathway to getting to our emission reduction targets and still taking into consideration economic impacts, fairness and equity. Each pathway scenario will include associated economic modelling to show the impacts and opportunities of the key decisions in each scenario. How we'll go about doing that is we're going to use a modelling framework that has been established by CSIRO and Climateworks. It's a multi-model framework. It's transparent, it's reproducible, it's well documented. A very similar framework was recently used by the Commonwealth Climate Change Authority to look into their interim targets review. So to give a bit of a very high level overview of the models, if we start from the left, we've got GTEM, which stands for Global Trade and Environment Model. As the name suggests, it looks at global macroeconomics. RTEM is the regional model that looks at the regional economics aspects. And together, what they do is they capture the macro and microeconomic dynamics, the international trade and investment responses to carbon price and decarbonisation. So there's the economic part of it. And then in the middle, we have land use trade-off model, which looks at the trade-off between agricultural land and planting. and it takes into consideration things like cost, biodiversity, and water as just a few examples. And then right at the end on the right, we have OzTimes, which is a semi-equilibrium energy system model that provides the cost-effective energy, emissions, and technology pathways. And it gives us information on, like, what are the technology mix, what's the energy mix, what's the emissions by source for each pathway, depending on how we set it up and the inputs and assumptions we put in. So those sources are then split into the commission sectors so that we then get a result similar to the illustrative pathway we showed earlier. So the key information that is on here on this slide is just an overview. It's not comprehensive. There's a lot more going on with these models than what we've got on the slide. And what we really want is the call for evidence information from people that that is passed on to us. What we can do is we'll use them in a number of ways. So we can either directly use it in the modeling in one of these three models, or all of them, or we can use it to sense check the model outputs or help us interpret model results. So depending on the information that's passed to us, we'll make use of it in different ways. And our call for evidence paper has questions that guide you through your submission and the information we're looking for in a little bit easier to understand format than probably the three models approach. So if you've had a look at our call for evidence paper, it breaks up the questions into 5 categories. And what it does is you don't need to answer every question. We know there's quite a number of questions on there. You can answer as many relevant questions as you would like. To give a really simple example of the type of information we're looking for through the questions is, like, maybe your organization or business may have experience with implementing abatement technology or done a feasibility study for decarbonizing a process, and you can then just answer specific questions to those things. Or for councils and communities, you may have information on workforce pressures or changes to land use in your local area. So you might want to target your answers to those questions. The questions are not comprehensive. If you have other insights, we would still love to know about them and hear from you. And we also really welcome any specific information that are like data, modeling, technology studies, or other on the ground experience that you may have. It makes us it helps us to make the pathways more robust and grounded in real-world data. We are mindful that some information may be confidential, especially at a facility or business level. They are often the really useful real-world information. So if you do have confidential information that can be shared with us, please mark it as confidential in your submission. We'll treat all confidential information with the appropriate security level and won't publish it. Sorry, controls are not working. Okay, so what we're doing is we've put out a call for evidence. It's on our website. We have opened it for 6 weeks, so it will be going till the 31st of July. Like we said, we would love to hear from industries, businesses, research bodies, councils, communities, anyone with information, or anyone who has real world experience you'd like to share with us. We'll love to hear from you. And really what we'll do with that information is help us shape the 3 scenarios, help us shape the outputs and the results so that we can make them more robust. And we're just making sure that our data is up to date. It's based in real world and practical experience. And for my last slide, I'll just give a bit of a time frame. It is quite a big project we're doing. So we're starting at the moment, we're in kind of the second row, or like second call out, doing the call for evidence, but there's a bit of overlap in our timelines. We're also looking into our baseline model where we can compare the actions against the pathway scenarios to the baseline. And our call for evidence is broken up into 2 stages. So we're doing a public call that's open for 6 weeks, as I said, but we also are doing targeted engagement. So if once you've made a submission to us, if we may contact you for further information or to ask questions to clarify kind of any parts of your submission. So please let us know if you don't, you would not like to be contacted. We can also not do that, but we would love to kind of like, if we've got questions, it'll be great to be able to talk to people individually, and that's what stage 2 is about. So all the call for evidence, as I was saying, will go into developing the pathway scenarios, and then so that comes as later on this year, we'll be developing and modelling the 3 pathway scenarios, and as part of that process to make the entire project more robust, we will have a peer review stage as part of that as well, to make sure that any inputs and assumptions we're putting in is looked over and agreed by an expert. So that's kind of our overview of the Pathways project. And what we have now is a bit of a Q&A time for everyone. And I will invite to join me in the Q&A. We've got Dr. Stuart Witten, the Research Director at CSIRO, and Manuel Wirich, Manager Missions, as Will introduced earlier, and myself. And we also have Tim Graham from ClimateWorks Centre, who will help us moderate the discussions and the Q&A. So I pass over to Tim to give a bit more information.
Thank you very much, Ruby, and thanks for a great presentation as well. As Will mentioned earlier, we'll be accepting all questions through the Q&A function on the right-hand side of the Microsoft Teams window. So if you do have a question, please pop it in there and we'll get to it. But I might just start with a question for perhaps you, Ruby, which is how would I actually go about making a submission if I had some evidence?
So we have a link, and I can put the link in. I'll post the link in the chat. You can either do it 2 ways. You can either fill in the form. We have a form that you can just fill in online, or you can actually write to us as a letter or any other form of submission and upload it through the same link. So I'll put the link into the chat so everyone's got a copy of it.
Great. Thanks very much, Ruby. And another one, perhaps, this one's for Stuart. When evidence has been submitted, how will this information actually be used to inform the modelling?
Thanks, Tim. So generally speaking, the models use publicly available information where possible, and in some cases it's more confidential, but it's still information from verified sources. Where possible, though, we'd like to receive information that allows us to sense check or scale that to New South Wales. So, often these data sets are national in nature, they don't break down to state level. So having that sort of state level information allows us to sense check it, and it allows us to test the sort of results that may come out of the models and make sure that they are actually verified at that state level.
Great, thanks. That was very useful. And I think perhaps that leads quite well to a question we have in the Q&A from Emma Stevens, which asks, so we've mentioned that we're seeking evidence from across the state of New South Wales. Are you also open to international examples from where you may be able to learn from regions or other places that have done it before, lessons learned or other best practices? So perhaps for Stuart, if you'd like to take that.
I'll take part of it. So clearly, where there's international transitions that allow us to look at pathways in the sense of providing information about speed of change and so on, we can take that on board in the modelling sense. But the more general comment about pathways in an international context is more about the learning and transition space. So I'm going to actually handball that across to Ruby and Manuel.
Annie, do you want to take that one?
Sure, yes, absolutely. We do want to learn from international experience and examples. Generally, we will look for examples where I guess the international jurisdiction is comparable to New South Wales in certain ways. There are often differences in how the economy is made up, what kind of industries exist, one thing is also population size, depending on some of the parameters. We're kind of looking for similar examples in that way, but there's lots to learn from others. There are a lot of good examples in how progress is monitored from the UK, from New Zealand, the Australian national level as well. But there's also really interesting governance concepts, for example, in Scandinavia or in France and other places where, for example, government reports on their budgets and has a little emissions tag on every budget item in the official government budget. So things like that are really interesting for us to look at. Not all of them are relevant for our pathways, but we're really interested to learn from those. So yes, please put in any suggestions for where we could look internationally.
Great, thanks for that, Manuel and Stuart. We've just had a little bit of a flurry of questions come through, which is great to see. I might bring Ruby in with one, which is around how you see the Commission's work interacting with other policy and reviews going on, for example, the Safeguard Mechanism review, the upcoming CCA work on on-site abatement, and some other bits as well.
Yeah, and I guess this is probably a bit more of a broader question than just the projections in some ways, because definitely we, as Will has mentioned in his introduction to the Commission, we have a few functions and we do generally provide advice to government and to educate the general public. So the work that Damien has mentioned about things like climate change authorities work or safeguard mechanism, we are in discussions with the Climate Change Authority quite regularly, actually, to actually cross-inform and make sure that we're understanding what their work is and they're understanding what we do. So definitely those work will still happen, and we'll still be keeping discussions with anything that happens on a national level, and anything that is relevant for the Pathways project we'll take it into account where possible. As Stuart said, where things might be helpful in informing the modelling, we'll be using that. But where things might be happening at a broader level, we'll take it into account as part of our work as a Commission.
Great. Thanks very much, Ruby. So yeah, as we've continued to get some very good questions in, I'm seeing a few questions around types of information and evidence. So we've got a question about what kind of evidence we're looking for in relation to the just transition, whether there is an interest in community sentiment and social license research. And we also have a question about how qualitative evidence might be translated into the modelling stage of the project. So I might throw that one to the panel for whoever would like to take it.
I can take part of the qualitative one, Tim. So a good example of where we'd like to hear qualitative evidence is around major facilities and timing to change. So if you have something like a aluminium smelter such as in the Hunter, there's quite a long time period if you want to change technology there. And you can, where there's a submission that might provide qualitative evidence about taking a shorter or longer period of time to be able to actually pivot to a new technology, you can then use that to either calibrate or check the results out of modelling. But there's plenty of other examples of qualitative evidence that have quantitative outcomes in modelling, and you can use to test the confidence of the results you get out of it.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. And maybe to add to that at a more broader level, also to community sentiment or social license for change and things like that. The models themselves are obviously numeric things and they optimize a certain parameter. So it's difficult to put all of these broader considerations into a model. What input on those kind of things helps us do is figure out what might be reasonable to include in the model, what kind of economic parameters we want to put in, but then also how we interpret the results. And Ruby mentioned this before when she did the presentation, that a lot of it will also be about how we understand the results from the model and how we sort of communicate what we take from them. behavior change is a big one. You know, if we expect people to drive less, or if we expect people to switch from one technology to another technology, like from an internal combustion engine car to an electric car, there are lots of parameters that influence that. And your input, or people's input on what might change those kind of things, those uptake rates, are really important. So it would be great to sense check our assumptions and our thinking against what you can provide us in this call of evidence. Yeah, looking forward to that input.
All right, thanks very much, Manny and Stuart. That was very useful. I've seen a couple of questions that are actually related to how the outputs of the project will be used. Will they be used to inform New South Wales government actions or policies, and also whether we can comment on how this might impact 2040 and 2045 targets for the state? Maybe we'll go to Ruby to keep going around the circle.
Right. Actually, I was going to throw to Manny. Manny, do you want to talk about how it'll be used first with the monitoring and the tracking that we want to do before we get into the kind of more detailed information?
Absolutely. Thank you, Ruby. So the pathways, again, we only touched on that very briefly in the presentation to keep it short. But the pathways will basically provide a set of benchmarks. So we can say, you know, the middle pathway, the balanced pathway, will be our best guess at what is reasonable for how we can get to net zero. And that will help us as the Commission provide advice to government and to the public on where we're at on that journey. So we can, for example, see that, I'm using the electric vehicle example again, that we might have uptake, or the percentage of new vehicles sold that are electric vehicles or low emissions vehicles might be much less than what we would expect that we would need for a balanced scenario to get to net zero. And then our advice might be, if we want to make sure that we are on track with net zero, government should try and work towards increasing the uptake of electric vehicles. So the pathway is a really useful tool. Not that they provide the exact way that we will follow that exactly, but they'll provide us a really good indication for what kind of change is needed over time in different sectors or with different parameters like vehicle uptake. So very useful for that. It will also, and that touches on the 2040 and 45 target question, it will also help inform other people, including government's work. So the net zero targets, the interim targets for 2040 and 2045 will not be set by the Commission. It's a government task to set them. The government might ask the Commission for advice on them, and these pathways are probably part of that evidence base that will inform what kind of the numbers are. So yeah, really important input for that. Did you want to elaborate on that a little bit, Ruby?
Yeah, and I guess like agree with what you said, Manny, but also just to add a little bit of we were saying, like, this is our first very New South Wales specific set of pathways. So we are concentrating our scenarios on the existing legislated targets and making sure that, we're providing good advice on how do we achieve them. And one of the things that can be done, and we've seen it in other jurisdictions like in the UK, or like what CCA has done, is they can inform interim targets, as Manny was saying, but also also to we can look at it in terms of, can we set budgets? Can we look at sector specific, whole of economy, different things. So there's quite a lot of outputs that we can get out of the pathways project. And I guess at this stage, we need to determine, make sure that what are our scenarios to make sure that we're looking at what are we doing for the current legislated targets, and how do we actually reach them as a first instance, and what kind of advice will we be wanting to provide to help the state keep on track.
Great, thanks, Ruby and Manny. So I'm hearing that the pathways work will be used to advise New South Wales government. I've got an interesting question here from Nick, which is kind of a bit of a question about how the New South Wales government grapples with different policies, which I'm not going to ask you what they should do about that, but maybe flip that into a bit of a modelling question. So the question's about how the New South Wales government is opening the Far West to gas exploration. And they also want some gas projects to proceed. How might the modelling handle these types of dynamics of gas exploration going on while still trying to meet those targets? So perhaps Stuart's best place to answer that question.
Yeah, so I won't answer it in deep detail because that'll be part of the process here. But all of these types of models have assumptions around an energy mix through time, and they're broadly calibrated to the Australian energy market operators, future power demand and sourcing modelling as well. So we'll be looking at that, and we can unpack what that might mean for different sectors within the state, and then look at whether that matches the projections from other thinking. So for in this case, scale and timing of any expansion of the gas industry in New South Wales.
Right, thanks very much, Stuart. I might stick with another slightly more technical and modelling question, which is around the land sector. Does the modelling consider just emissions, or look at emissions and removals as well, thinking about land use change?
It looks at emissions and removals as well. It also looks at changes in the emissions profile from agriculture and to some extent more generally in other forms of land use.
Great, thanks very much, Stuart. We have had a few kind of very slightly more technical questions coming through. For the purpose of the webinar, we're kind of staying a little less technical, but what I will do is pop in to the chat, to the Q&A, some links to some different documentation about previous exercises that have used similar modelling, so people can feel free to check there, and we may share some of that information via email as well. But I might switch tact a little bit and throw a question to Ruby, which is around data and confidentiality. So the question is that we mentioned earlier that some data information, the call for evidence, maybe need to be dealt with confidentially. But would you still like this information to be provided, for example, to be able to just verify the models, so that information is confidential but not presented to the public?
Yeah, so we will, and I think part of the question talks about the our GIPA Act, the Government Freedom of Information Act, and so we will mark any confidential information, especially if you've got anything that's commercial in confidence, because there's a few things we take into account when we actually get asked for information through the GIPA Act, and so this will all fall under that umbrella to make sure that we're not giving away information just because you've provided it to us. So there are actually parameters under that we can we will look into and make sure that no confidential information are getting out. But it is something we have had discussions with CSIRO and Climateworks with as well, to make sure that we are storing and securing things properly, and that nothing gets outside of this project, so that we are we want people to feel confident to be able to give us information, and that we can keep that information secure, despite both CSIRO and us being agencies under certain acts, but yeah, there are actually I guess nuances under the acts that we will look into if that comes about.
Thanks, Ruby. We also have an interesting question here about ambition, and how might the modelling include more ambitious scenarios or pathways in the government's 2050 timeline. So how can the model and scenario planning support this type of question. I think I'll just throw that to the panel, and whoever wants to take it can.
Did you want to go, Manny, or do you want me to?
Please go.
Oh, I was going to say that, that is actually why we're modeling 3 scenarios. Our scenarios will look at different rates of transition. So if you've got good information that kind of can help inform, a more ambitious, or what we would call the fast track scenario, we'll love to take that into account so that we can make it a bit more realistic as well. We don't want to be overly optimistic with our fast tracking either. So it would be great to if anyone's got information, to make sure that we, if you give it to us, we'll take it into account to help shape the kind of different scenarios with things moving at different pace.
Great, thanks. That's really useful, Ruby. So I might swing back to some more technical questions as a technical person myself. We've got a question from Nick about asking if we can unpack a little what the economic modelling for each pathway might consider. So I think we can stay kind of high level for everyone, but what are the kind of things that modelling will consider, and what might it tell us as well? Thanks. I see Stuart come off mute. A question for you, I think.
Sure. So we're talking about regional scaling here, Tim, just to clarify.
Yes. Just the economic modelling broadly. What might it look like, and what will it consider?
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah. So the economic modelling considers population trajectory and an economic growth trajectory, and then splits that up by sector. You can manipulate that to some degree to explore changes that you anticipate. We use a global model because New South Wales is a small-ish economy in a global scale, and it has a lot of what goes on here is determined by trade interactions. So that's the G10 part, and then we use a regional scale model within that to split that up by region, so you can get those sorts of future sectoral pathways by region. The regions are, at least at first level, they're at the SA4 region in New South Wales, although there are some challenges around SA4 regions for Sydney, for example, because it's so integrated. But it gives you a regional understanding of how these sorts of shifts might propagate or otherwise vary across the state.
Great. Thanks, Stuart. I might use my moderator's privilege to ask a little follow-up question. So you mentioned New South Wales is quite small economically compared to the rest of the world. What, looking forward, what kind of assumptions will the pathways and modelling make about what's going on in the rest of the world?
Oh, sure. We tend to set the model up to largely follow the International Energy Agency assumptions about future energy demand on a global scale. They're the ones that really, really matter from the purposes of emissions pathways. So they're by far the most important ones. And the IEA assumptions give you an understanding of likely shifts in technology across all major fossil fuel emissions sources. So your electricity and your electricity market in particular, but then more generally around your liquid fossil fuels and so on as well. It also gives you some understanding of where they see variations in exports internationally. So we can have a look at whether our assumptions align with theirs for exports of coal, say, from New South Wales over time.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Stuart. That was great. I have a question here from Fahana, which is about how offsets are considered in achieving targets. I know we mentioned earlier that there will be both emissions and emissions removals considered in the modelling. How does that interact with or not with offsets? And
so
sorry,
offsets,
again to you, Stuart.
Yeah. So offsets are included in the modelling in all cases. They obviously vary by scenario. You have more offsets in very ambitious ones and less otherwise. We use relatively standard practice in the sense of identifying sensible rates of offset technology development. Most of these models also have some engineered carbon removal from the system in one form or another, and we'll be quite transparent about those when we do the modelling and when it's released. By engineered, I mean either carbon capture and storage or other forms of carbon capture and reuse.
And maybe if I can just add to that, Stuart, we're really interested in hearing from people about what people think is realistic and where they see markets going as well. There's obviously a lot of land use change associated with environmental plantings that are often used for sort of carbon offset projects where people sort of reforest areas or where people change the land use from pasture to forestry. And those kind of things make a big difference in terms of how we set up the assumptions in the models. Generally, all of that is sort of simplified in the models into carbon prices, and then there's balances with what that means for other emissions reduction technologies. So really interested in a few things there. If people have views on at what point certain industries cannot abate or will not be able to abate for financial reasons, so technical and financial reasons, and then what that has to be compensated to get to net zero. So really interested in people's views on what that is, what those limits are for the different industries, especially in your own industries, and hearing a bit about the timeframes for when abatement technology uptake is likely. That might be after the 2035 target, and there needs to be an interim solution for us to achieve the 2035 target. So those kind of views will be very welcome.
Great, thanks very much, Manuel. So we have a question here that's about how the New South Wales emissions targets will feed into the modelling. Will they be broken down by sector? And how might the modelling allocate appropriate shares from each sector? Is the project aiming to produce sectoral budgets as an output of the project? I might see who'd to take that one.
I can start.
I can take the modelling.
Stuart's going to take it.
I can take the modelling part, but not the target side. That'll be how the modelling is used. But the models are economic models in the sense of they have built into them plausible rates of change over time, so that they're set up in a way that reflects current emissions by sector with plausible notional technology within. So you get a progression over time, and that allows you to get a feeling for which sectors transition at what speed. So as many people on the call will be well aware, the electricity sector is transitioning rapidly at the moment, which is leading to a fairly steep fall off projected over the reasonably near future. But some heavy industries are they don't really have a slated timeline on them because it's quite expensive and difficult to figure out an alternative energy source for high temperature heating and so on. So the model has to some extent that built in, and you get plausible sector pathways out of that as long as you test it and so on. What you do with them is over to Ruby and
Yeah, and I guess just to also give a bit of a clarification point, we're not breaking down the targets into by sector. It's what Stuart actually kind of outlined. It's how each sector will work together to actually meet those whole of economy targets. So just a bit of a nuance, like to clarify, but also I guess that is part of what we're looking for the project. As I mentioned earlier, Manny was talking about as well, we out of this project we can cut the information in different ways, and actually we need to actually have a think about what's the best form of advice that we might want to give to actually make sure that to fulfill our functions, but also make sure that the state is on track to what is legislated. So, and that could look like sector budgets. It could look like, you know, interim targets that we talked about earlier. It could look like a range of things, but I guess that's part of kind of what we're working through as well, and having a look at like what other jurisdictions have done, what will be useful here in New South Wales, and taking all of that into account before we kind of make the advice that or have it form part of our work in our advice function. I don't know, many of you wanted to add to that.
No, maybe I'll just reinforce it just so it's 100% clear. So we're not kind of setting a sector split of what the targets mean and then modeling that. It's the other way around. We're trying to model a likely pathway, and then that will tell us which sector has to do or will likely do more or less in early years or later years.
Great, thanks everyone. So what I'm hearing is that rather than an input to the exercise, breaking down the sectors, the exercise is actually going to help to inform us about the speed at which different sectors might transition. I'll move back quickly to, I know we've already spoken a bit about removals and offsets. We do have a specific question about how we might consider carbon offsets for ACCUs, for example, that are purchased outside of New South Wales, but used to offset emissions within New South Wales. Perhaps Stuart might like to take that.
Yeah, so the modelling that we use is not it's not an institutionally boundary defined model. So we, in the sense of it would not pick up where firms are purchasing ACCUs outside the state. We're more interested in the geographic boundary where the activity is happening. You can make adjustments to it, to the sort of outputs where you think that this is a significantly material challenge you need to consider.
Yeah, and it's a really good point here. Good question actually, because if you look at purely the Scope 1 emissions, so the direct emissions from activities and human activities and natural activities, then you know, those certificates like ACCUs, ACCUs, they relate to an activity that happened somewhere. And so if the creation of the certificate is related to a farm in Victoria, then that activity is not in New South Wales, and the carbon will not be sequestered in New South Wales, and so it doesn't count towards the New South Wales inventory. And if a New South Wales company buys that certificate, that doesn't change the New South Wales emissions balance. But what we're really interested in for this modelling exercise or these pathways is, you know, what are the drivers that we're seeing? How big will the demand for those certificates be from New South Wales corporations especially? Will that have an impact on what landholders will do in New South Wales, and how big will that impact be? Over what time frame? You know, how much land use change will there likely be possible, or will be done with what kind of carbon price? So those things really do affect New South Wales emissions and New South Wales sequestration of carbon, and we're really interested in people's views on that, both the kind of demand side and the supply side.
Great, thanks, Manny. That was very clear. A kind of related question, which I think that you answered part of, but how would we like to consider the trade-offs between those really hard to abate emissions in some of those sectors that Stuart was mentioning earlier versus the threshold for when we consider that offsets might be the easier option? I wonder if you might like to comment on that, Manuel.
Well, I mean, I can throw it to you, Stuart, for the kind of how the model does that. That might be a good way to start, and then I can add to it if there's anything to add.
Yeah. So there's two ways you can do these sorts of things in the modelling. You can set a plausible trajectory that allows a maximum amount of offsets into the model against these. we're providing they're price competitive. So the model has some costs associated with these, and those costs they have a technology dependency in the sense that they fall over time as these technologies become more mainstream and mature, and they come into the markets, essentially at a point where the cost of further reducing complex and expensive activities, it becomes more worthwhile to look to offset. Or you can, in some instances, we may believe that, in fact, the technology won't grow quite fast enough to meet the demand there, so you can actually limit the amount that comes in. We tend to do the same to some degree in the land sector in terms of land sector offsets, because there is a plausible limit to the amount of trees and tree planting activity that you would see go on, and there are also some more natural price limits in that sector as you start to push into higher productivity land where you're converting that. So that's the way the modelling handles it. A mix of plausible assumptions and market prices.
And I think you're just saying, Stuart, that that the model allows us to do a lot of things, and we can either restrict things because we think they're not likely to happen faster, or we can say they must happen faster because we think it will be driven by policy or by markets. So that the model really allows us that flexibility. This call for evidence is to help us make those choices, right? And so you'll by providing input into what is likely, you'll help us make that decision or make those choices in the assumptions in a way that's the most realistic for New South Wales, both in the faster and the slower and the balanced scenarios. So really looking forward to input on those pieces from everyone.
Great, thanks both. We're drawing near to the end of the Q&A section, so I might just go with one last question. So we've mentioned there's been a few questions about LGAs, different spatial units, and Stuart was mentioning how many trees might be able to be planted in different places. We've got a question here about how the pathways might apply spatially across New South Wales, and I might add to that, how might we apply the findings of the pathways to in a spatial fashion across New South Wales? I think Stuart was going to jump in.
I just repeat what I said earlier, which is that the model is set up in such a way that it can model these at SA4 level, and you can, within SA4, there are ways and means that you can look to divide a smaller where you need to, but generally SA4 gives you an indication of likely pathways by region.
Great, thanks, Stuart. And maybe, Ruby, you can comment on how we might be looking to apply the findings, spatially, whether or not that's something that we're thinking of.
Look, we would love to have, I guess this is part of the call for evidence process, is that the finer detail information we get, the more we can test and understand how it applies in different areas, and especially in local areas where there's not a lot of information. So I think this is where one of the ones where we're really wanting to put the kind of feelers out there of going, well, if anyone's got very specific information that would help us sense check and make look at things in different ways, that will be really useful. And some will be obviously easier than others, as Stuart said, the model obviously looks at it at one scale, but we know certain sectors might be really concentrated in different regions or LGAs, and other things and the transition might be happening differently. So where information, if you've got it available, will be really helpful for us to kind of look at how we then apply it, the model results, to make it more specific to different regions and areas.
Great, thanks, Ruby and Stuart. And with that, I might draw the Q&A to a close. Thank you, everyone, for some really engaging, interesting questions, and thank you to our panel for providing some brilliant answers. So I might pass back to you, Ruby. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Tim. Manny and Stuart, thanks for helping us answer the questions. Thank you everyone for joining us today and for your interest in our Pathways project. We really appreciate you taking the time to come on this call and to consider the call for evidence. Like what Will said at the start, like your input helps us develop the pathways that reflect real challenges and opportunities here in New South Wales, and how we actually move towards our legislated targets. So if you do have any more questions or you've got uncertain about like your submission, you can reach out to our inbox. It's actually on our website in the link that I posted earlier. You can also subscribe to our newsletters and follow us on LinkedIn. We'll be providing regular updates of this project because it is quite a long project for us. So yeah, we have a web page set up and you can check on the, we'll try and provide up-to-date information on that. But otherwise, thank you so much again for your time.